this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
In March 1941, 40,000 Australian and New Zealand troops were rushed to Greece in a desperate attempt to support the Greeks against the looming threat of a German attack. Although the operation was ultimately doomed to fail, the Aussies and Kiwis managed to hold up the German advance long enough to evacuate thousands to Crete, where Hitler then set his sights. I'm Angus Wallace, and joining me today is Craig Collie, the author of Where the Flaming Hell Are We?, the story of young Australians and New Zealanders fighting the Nazis in Greece and Crete. So for this episode, we'll be delving into these overlooked, disastrous operations in the Mediterranean. But before we begin, I want to extend a big thank you to David Phillipson from the History Guild, who suggested our guest today and connected me with Craig. The History Guild has a project focusing on Australians in the Mediterranean theatre during World War II. For more articles and posts on the topic, visit historyguild.org. That's historyguild.org. Craig, thanks for joining me. We'll be focusing on the deployment of the Australian and New Zealand forces in this early part of World War II. To start, could you give us an overview of the forces available in both countries at the time? Had they anticipated fighting a foreign war? How prepared were they? For instance, Britain had introduced conscription in 1939. Did Australia and New Zealand follow suit and to boost their armed forces as well?
They were enlisted. They volunteered. And in fact, in Australia, I'm not sure what the situation was in New Zealand, but in Australia, only those who volunteered. That was changed at some stage during the war, is my understanding, although I'm not sure what that was. So that the people who went across to the Middle East and on to Greece were just from all walks of life. They were only trained after they volunteered to join the war.
I think it's an interesting nuance for Australia that you can volunteer, but not necessarily volunteer for overseas service. Whereas in Britain, you kind of conscripted and you just went where you were sent.
The conscription we've had for Vietnam, it was voluntary, but my understanding, my number wasn't pulled out, so I wasn't involved in it. But my understanding is that there's a lot of pressure for you to volunteer. You know, the heroes will volunteer, the people with the yellow line right down their back will not, but that's their entitlement sort of thing.
They get shipped to the Middle East. I'm intrigued by, really, I mean, for many of them, they must have heard stories of volunteering and being shipped to the Middle East because they're going to sort of transit camps in Egypt, aren't they? How much understanding do these men have of why they're fighting? Are they fighting for Britain? Are they fighting for Australia? Are they fighting for the Commonwealth? Are they fighting for adventure?
Bit of all of those things. I think a lot of it was adventure. There were people in my book who had never been out of their hometown. There's a guy who had never been out of Rotorua, and another one who lived in Maryborough, I think it was, in rural Victoria. He enlisted because he said, I figured that I'd spend the rest of my life as a butcher in Maryborough, and I thought there had to be something more interesting than that. There was a sense that there was an obligation to go and defend Britain if it was under attack. So, yes, there was an attachment to the mother country, as it was then called here. It's not called that these days. So it was a mix, but it certainly wasn't just sort of fighting for God, king and country sort of patriotism. There was a bit of that, and I think a lot of it was just a sense of adventure, something different. Probably 90%, nearly 85 to 90% of those guys had never been out of Australia or New Zealand until they enlisted.
It's funny because Australia, being at the other side of the world, is not under threat. So it's not as if you can think, it's not like Britain where they feel they have to defend because they can see the threat. Australia, up to a point at this time of the war, must have felt fairly safe. So to volunteer, you have to be motivated by something. And I guess, the sense of adventure.
Yeah. So there was sort of vague sense that there's a sort of duty there for Australia as a country to support Britain in its time of need. But principally, they were there to see the world. At that stage, Australians and New Zealanders didn't travel much. There wasn't the ability to do it. Now they all do it and have for some decades. But then it was a novel thing.
Did they take part in those early campaigns in North Africa and against the Italians?
Yes, yep. The early part where the Italians drove the defenders back, they weren't involved there. But when it turned around, the Indian troops, first of all, sort of pushed them out of Egypt. They just encroached in Egypt a bit. And then the Indians were reassigned to deal with the Italians in Ethiopia. The Australians were brought in. New Zealanders were then in reserve. They'd been driving a lot of the trucks that brought the Indian troops out. And some of them had sort of been involved in the fighting just because it was there. But they were truck drivers taking part. So they weren't then so involved with the North Africa campaign. The Australians with English troops took over from the Indians who had started and drove the Italians back to Benghazi and just a bit beyond. But then they were taken off that because Churchill had decided that they were going to help the Greeks keep the Germans out of Greece.
They're part of what at that time is a successful campaign in North Africa against the Italians. And they performed when they moved to Greece. Now, presumably, if you're viewing, now I might be wrong here, because with my Anglo-centric view of the world, you might be able to view North Africa as sort of connected to Egypt, which connects you to Suez, which connects you to the Commonwealth. So troops presumably are fighting an understandable action to protect Suez and the Commonwealth. So when they're withdrawn to Greece, do we know what? Because there's the Greek, is it Luster Force? That is predominantly, I'm right in saying that's predominantly Australians and New Zealanders?
That's right. The combat troops certainly were Australians and New Zealanders primarily.
Do they understand why they're going to Greece?
Their orders are to go to Greece. In some cases, it wasn't until they were on the ship that they even knew they were going to Greece. A lot of them were just shipped on. The next move is to be taken somewhere by ship. You'll be told on the ship where it is that you're going. Not a great deal of explanation of why they were going to Greece was there. It was just the orders are to go to Greece, so we go to Greece. We're going to fight Germans. Oh, that's good because we hate them.
We're against them. We don't know where the Greeks stand, but we'll join the Greeks. How did they find Greeks? Greeks. How did they find Greece? Because I have this odd idea of Australians in the transit camps in Egypt, completely based on the film Gallipoli. So I have visions of the Australians in the transit camps in Gallipoli as sort of riding around on donkeys, raising hell in North Africa. How do they find Greece when they get there?
It's completely different. The sort of Gallipoli version that you're talking about was certainly a First World War thing. It wasn't quite as bad in the Second World War. The Australians and probably New Zealanders too were appalling in the First World War. The Second World War, they sort of settled down a bit in Egypt, but they'd sort of arrived with already primed by World War I veterans, sort of the Egyptians can't be trusted, they'll cut your throat as soon as look at you, blah, 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 blah. But they sort of modified that a bit, and there was this thing that they ran that the Australians sort of called all the Egyptians that they'd boot cleaners and guys running, carting them around, called them all George. For reason that no one understands. And then the Egyptians started calling the Australians George. It became a sort of shared joke that no one understood. So it settled down a bit. But then when they arrive in Greece, off the boats and sort of making their way in marching or being trucked to the transit camps on the outskirts of Athens, there are people sort of crowding the streets, waving flags, welcoming them, giving them sips of wine, throwing flowers at them, and they were bowled over by this sort of welcoming reception from people that they knew nothing about. That was the beginning of the sort of, if you like, love affair between the Australian, New Zealand soldiers and the Greek people. These are kids, a lot of them rural kids from Australia and New Zealand, didn't have any idea how the world worked. They only knew Greeks if their fish and chip shop was run by one. So they had no real perception of Greeks as a nation and people. And suddenly they're sort of being welcomed like the cavalry come to save them by all these people lining the streets, shouting, they're shouting hooray for the Australians, even when there were New Zealanders going by.
So at this point, when did they arrive? Is it April, May 41?
March 41.
March 41. So they're sent up to the
Aliakmon line.
Aliakmon line. So they're sent up to the Aliakmon line. At this point, Germany hasn't actually attacked Greece, has it?
No, they're approaching, and it's clear that that's their likely intention. It took a month to ship the force over from the Middle East because of the shortage of shipping to do that, and then they sort of trickle up by train or truck up to the northern end to man the Aliakmon line, which is sort of centre and north, and the top end. But most of them were along this sort of line that is just a line drawn on a map. There was no fortifications there. The Greeks had suggested that the existing fortifications along a line in Macedonia and Thrace called the Metaxas line, which had about 150 fortifications along it. But the Brits said, no, we'd like this line which is just the line of mountains. So they had to set up ad hoc fortifications there. The Germans, because the Yugoslavia had dudded them, came around the top, and they just sort of drove through Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia wasn't able to defend itself at all well. So they had to rush troops then from where they were on the Aliakmon line to the top end, to the Vevi Pass, which is where they were going to come through. So the first battle was at the Vevi Pass, right at the top of Greece.
Who's making these defensive positions? I mean, we already established that the majority of the combat troops are Australian and I think they're Australian and they're Australian and New Zealand troops. The Australian general is General Blamey. He's not in charge. How does this command structure work? Because essentially Australians and it's a Dominion country. I think both are Dominions. So they are independent countries.
As far, I think, as Churchill was concerned, they were just there at his disposal. They put General Jumbo Wilson in command, although Blamey, who's an interesting character, but I think a good strategist, and other people who know more about military strategy than me say that, they didn't want someone who wasn't British running it. So they sort of did this sort of accounting of how many troops, including all of the English troops that were mostly support areas and the standby who was still in England, and they were the reserves if it needed to come that, and did a calculation so that you had all these sort of additional numbers. So it was argued that there were more English troops than Australian or New Zealand, but the combat troops were nearly all Australian and New Zealand, plus the Greek ones that were not already tied up in Albania, keeping the attended Italian invasion at bay.
What's the relationship like between Blamey, Freyberg for the New Zealanders, and Wilson? And then I guess overall the theatre commanders, Wavell.
Both Freyberg and Blamey, the British told the New Zealand and Australian governments that they had spelt out what was happening with Blamey and Freyberg, and they were happy, and they told Freyberg and Blamey that their two governments had agreed, when in fact there'd only been some very superficial discussions at the most. There hadn't been a detailed discussion. In both cases, they had serious doubts about this is Freyberg and Blamey, about whether this campaign was going to be able to be done successfully. Some of the troops, because there was an Australian division that had been intended to be transferred to Greece, but when Rommel and the Germans joined the North African campaign at the same time as the Greek campaign was about to start, and because the British had pulled out some of the forces from North Africa to send them to Greece, those German troops started to drive in, reverse the reversal, if you like, and push their way back towards Egypt, across Libya. So the Australian division, which was intended to go to Greece, didn't. So already what Blamey felt was insufficient force with insufficient equipment was now even less.
It's easy to remember when you look at one campaign to remember that there's usually a lot more campaigns happening at the same time. And as you say, there's Rommel in North Africa. And I think at around the same time as what we're going to be discussing is the siege of Tobruk, which again is, I think it's the Australians, isn't it, holding out in Tobruk. So it's easy for us to be myopic on one small point with this. There is a lot in play all at the same time.
The other thing in play was that the Battle of Britain had just been completed and that had been held off. The suspicion was that, or the belief was that they needed to keep the bulk of the RAF there because there was expected to be another attempted invasion. So there was no air cover, no serious air cover, or certainly inadequate air cover in Greece by the Allies. The only air cover there was German and Italian. So all of those campaigns right through Greece and Crete later, they were subjected to daily bombing and strafing and machine gunning from the air with very little interference from the RAF, just because there were the disparity in numbers of planes.
Yeah, and the one thing the Luftwaffe does very well is tactical attacks against ground forces. Now, you mentioned before that Blamey and Freiberg had their misgivings about the campaign almost from the start. What were they concerned about?
The ad hoc nature of it, the lack of equipment, the shortage of equipment, really whether they were sufficiently equipped to take on a force as well trained and well equipped as the German one.
Do they have a direct link back to their home parliaments? I mean, I don't know how much they're conferred with. It's Menzies in Australia and Fraser in New Zealand. I don't know if they have a direct hotline back home, or does everything filter through?
Well, that was one of the problems that because Wavell was the commanding officer, then they had to respond to when the two governments found that they were not in supporting the proposal. When it was too late to do anything about it, by then the troops were already in or on the way to Greece. They told both of the generals that their first responsibility was to their own government, not to their commanding officer, which is the military tradition, but not the political tradition.
I guess that this is where the shadow of the First World War lies heavy, isn't it? Where presumably the New Zealand and the Australian commanders feel a responsibility to their country rather than necessarily just the military, slavishly the military chain of command.
Well, no, they did feel that their responsibility was to their commanding officer, which is the military. Well, one of their problems was that both of them felt that Wavell hadn't been asking their opinions. He'd just been instructing them on what they were doing, and they didn't feel that they had the authority to volunteer, if you like, a different point of view. That was their orders, so they carried them out as best they could, even though they had doubts about them.
It's the Battle of Vevey is that first action where it's almost a defensive, reactive action, isn't it? As the Germans just go around the end. Do they just go around the end of the line? And it's the Australians there.
They went across the top of the Aliakmon line, which is just a line on a map, as I say. It's not. They had to dig in when they were there, but this is a rocky hillsides that you're digging in. The best you can do usually is pile a few rocks around where your position is with guns and sort of cover the passes that they were going to come through. But they didn't. They came around the top, so they had to rush the troops to cover the Vevey Pass, which was a better one to pass through anyway, for the German intention. But they had only just arrived there. They were sort of virtually just setting up as when the Germans arrived. It hadn't been reconnoitred greatly, so it was unfamiliar territory.
Can they put any form of serious defence up?
They slowed it down by a day or two, but that's neither here nor there. They did the best they could, but there was not a great deal of coordination.
So a lot of these guys will have transited all the way up from North Africa, up all the way through Greece. They find a couple of days, and then now this must put them in reverse, and they're off backwards now. They're retreating.
Yes, there was a series of withdrawals. With Vevey, a lot of those guys, it would have been their first experience of combat. If they hadn't been, and not all of them had been actually fighting in North Africa, then it would have been their first, and certainly the New Zealanders hadn't, although they weren't as involved in the Greek part of the campaign as the Australians were.
They're at the other end of the line, though, aren't they? At Mount Olympus, the Greeks, the New Zealanders.
Yes, that's right. They were, the idea was that they should be there first because they were only a reserve force in North Africa. Then, as the Australians arrived, trickling in over 4 weeks, they would move to the north end of the Aliakmon line up in northern Greece. But that process was only just starting when they realised they had to rush several battalions to cover the pass at Devi. So the Australians just got rushed up straight up to there, and the New Zealanders stayed where they were only sort of temporarily setting up.
But they get hit by armour. Are they prepared for an armoured attack? But they're in mountainous terrain, so I'm not quite sure whether how much the mountains work in their favour.
Certainly, the artillery is what they had. They had British tanks, which mostly fell apart. They were mostly tanks that had been brought back from Libya and were due for servicing, but instead of servicing, they were sent to Greece, and a lot of them showed the lack of maintenance that they had been unable to get.
It's the next, and I mentioned this because it just sort of thrilled me, the fact that it's Thermopylae. Is that the next major defensive line? This is obviously made famous with Leonidas with his 300 Spartans holding up the Persians. Does this prove to be a stout defensive position for the Anzac troops?
Well, it didn't matter because before the Germans got there, they decided to abandon Greece altogether. So by the time the Germans got to the Thermopylae line, it was just a delaying action. Although there was between those two, the Aliakmon line got moved 90 degrees, got swung around, because by coming around and down the back of the Aliakmon line, you needed a new Aliakmon line, which ran across the path that they were now coming. And that had been very hastily set up. It held up the advancing force for a few days, a week, which was enough to be able to set up at Thermopylae, which is what they wanted. But then the renegade Greek general who was on the one end of the Thermopylae line had already taken it upon himself to surrender to the Germans. And then Greece itself surrendered. A lot of the Greek army was not persuaded right from the start, before the campaign started, that there was any point in attempting to stop the German invasion.
Yeah, it's funny because considering how well they'd done against the Italians.
Everyone, including particularly the Italians, were surprised that they had done as well as they had. But as a result, that campaign had gone on, and they were sort of for a few months. So the Greeks were sort of fairly exhausted. They were not well equipped. They had fighting spirit, but not great equipment, and certainly not equipment that could hold the Germans off for long. Greece had greater contact with Germany than with Britain at that time. The Germans had built their telephone system. They'd had a lot of economic ties before the war started. Britain had ignored them until they needed them, and they needed them to persuade the American electorate that they were fighting Nazis, not protecting the Suez Canal, the channel that brings the spoils of empire to Britain, is the way the American public saw it.
It's a whole episode potentially on why defend Greece. It's an interesting one. But what point does Wavell decide to evacuate? Because I mean, it must feel like everyone's still arriving as they suddenly turn around and decide they have to leave.
It was the point at which Greece said, we're getting out. We're not continuing.
All right. So what's the withdrawal like? Because it's hard to disengage. Does it become a rout? I mean, are we looking at a sort of scenes like Dunkirk with beaches full of men trying to get off?
Yep, they're very similar. The beaches were spread quite a bit, so that there were about 6 or 8 beaches widespread in southern Greece that they evacuated from. It was done over several nights, and they didn't want if they did it from the same beach, then the Luftwaffe will just turn up each night at the beach. So it was a different beach each night. The Royal Navy and transport ships were sent up. They were sort of taken out on barges, and then the troop ships took them back. But they could only do it at night. The Luftwaffe very seldom flew at night. But they may well have made an exception if they knew where it took them a while to work out that the whole force was being evacuated. And by the time they worked out where they were being evacuated from, it had moved somewhere else.
I'm not always sure the Royal Navy comes out always very well from these evacuations, but I can't help but think at the time they were fearful of the absolute German air superiority walloping their ships, which is absolutely justifiable.
And had lost quite a few of them because of that. So it could only be done at night.
How many Aussies and Kiwis get left on Greece, failed to get evacuated? Is there a lot wandering around?
Well, there were 1,000 perhaps that were wandering around, but I think of the order of 6,000 or 7,000 that were just captured. They were left on the beaches. They were poorly armed. There was nowhere to go. And you had a sort of well-oiled army rolling into town.
Rolling them up. What happens to those who are roving around? Do the Greeks help them get off? Can many manage to get away?
Yes, quite a few sort of found their way, either found fishing boats. There was some patrolling for a couple of days by a British destroyer at night, picking up a few people. There were deals made to get fishing boats to take you to islands, and you did island hopping to Turkey in some cases. Some of them got to Crete. Some of them just sort of wandered around and eventually got captured. There was a lot of assistance from Greek villages, not as strongly as happened subsequently in Crete, where the Cretan people at risk to their lives would hide the Australians and New Zealanders. In mainland Greece, more connection, if you like, to Germany than in Crete. Germany, as I said, it sort of had connections before the war with Greece, and its military, a lot of them had training in Germany. But now, the way things had turned out, they were fighting with the English. The Germans were invading their country, so you change your mind. But they also were conscious of whether trying to stop the German invasion had any point at all, and was always to the Greeks, I think, a bit of a lost cause. But King George of Greece, who was a bit of an Anglophile, was persuaded to attempt to, with British support, which was never as much as they'd been told, to attempt to stop the German invasion.
So you mentioned Crete there, that they're withdrawn to Crete, the island of Crete.
Half of them are withdrawn to Crete, and half of them were to Egypt. The reason for that is the faster warships, the smaller ones, wanted to turn around. So they offloaded the evacuated troops that they'd picked up from mainland Greece on Crete and then turned back. The sort of bigger troop ships, which couldn't move as quickly, went on to Egypt. So whether you were offloaded on Crete or Egypt was random. It depended on which sort of ship you'd end up on. And they were there without any heavy equipment. The artillery was left behind, the trucks were left behind, a lot of their equipment was left behind. Some of them, the Bren guns and things they carried, the tanks were left behind, although most of them had fallen apart anyway. The Bren gun carriers were left behind. They'd survived better. So they were there, and they were told when they arrived in Crete that they were just there temporarily as a garrison until fresh troops could be brought. But fresh troops were not available. So sometime after that, they were told, well, you're staying now and you'll be defending an anticipated invasion of Crete, and we'll try and get what equipment we can get to you. But that was very limited.
Well, I was going to say, what condition were all the men in? They've walked up Greece, they've walked back, well, not walked, they've transited up Greece, they've transited back down Greece, they've left off the beaches. They must have been arrived, presumably, demoralised, ad hoc units.
Not convinced that their sort of leadership of the whole thing had been that well planned. They felt that given for a start, having your own air force up there defending you would have given you a chance to show that you were able to fight the Germans as well as they could fight you. The feeling was that they hadn't had the chance to show the invader what they could do, and that was because it was a campaign they suspected that had been poorly planned, was never going to get the result that they were looking.
Might that be a reason why they choose Freyberg to be the commander on Crete?
Yes, there were slightly more than New Zealand soldiers in Crete than Australian. Blamey had already been evacuated to Egypt. I think there was British concern that the two Commonwealth countries were not persuaded that they had got a fair shake out of the whole thing, that Jumbo Wilson was a journeyman general at best. He wasn't particularly impressive, and there was nothing impressive that he did in Greece. He just did a series of withdrawals and withdrew pretty quickly in each occasion. He didn't hold out. So they sent him to look after the Middle East. There was problems in Iraq, a threatened uprising there that he was sent to deal with. Freyberg had been offloaded in Crete, and I think the belief was that if we don't put an Australian or a New Zealander in charge here, we'll have the two Commonwealth countries pulling out of it.
He's a pretty impressive military figure, is Freyberg, isn't he? Freyberg VC.
Yes. He'd had a good First World War.
I always find it amusing. He had a good First World War. It's like, he was wounded 20 times, but I would suggest he still had a good First World War because I think he seemed to have joined military life.
Yes, he was a professional soldier. He always had reservations about whether they had the people, the equipment to hold off the Germans again, having been through them once. But it was, we'll do the best we can, was his attitude. He'd advised, as in fact had Wilson, but they'd already decided that Wilson was going to go. They sort of moved Wilson because he gave a sort of negative appraisal of what they could do in Crete. Freyberg gave the same negative appraisal, but they just said, well, you have to do it. Yeah.
It feels like a poisoned chalice. We'll give it to the colonial who we think will lose anyway, and if he does, well, good luck.
Well, they gave it the colonial because there were political problems with the two colonial governments that they needed to appease, and Freyberg was the more convenient of the two, Freyberg or Blamey. Blamey was given some sort of nominal role as assistant deputy commander of the Middle East Command.
I wondered, and I just wondered if Freyberg might have been seen more as a fighting general. He refused to be withdrawn from Greece, didn't he? Where Blamey went early when ordered.
That's right. Yeah, no, that's true. Freyberg was more a field general, a fighting general. Blamey was a strategist and a good one. He knew how to move things around and get the most out of your resources, more than most generals.
What's it like, Crete, for these guys? I assume they're actually expected to be assaulted from the sea.
No, they knew that there was a likely air attack. The breaking of the codes was fairly early days then. In fact, the Enigma had only been penetrated in the German Air Force, not in the Navy or the Army at that stage. The British code breakers were still in the process of setting up a sort of system, if you like, of processing the limited penetration they had. So they had enough to suggest that there was an intended air attack, paratroop attack, and amongst other things, that was because their paratroops were already in a camp on the outskirts of Athens. They had to be there for some reason. It was intended to be supported by a sea support attack, which would land reinforcements and tanks. And Freyberg's main concern was when it looked like tanks were being landed by sea, that would swing the battle, because they had 6 heavy tanks were all that he had to work with by the time the battle itself started, plus a few light tanks. So ships landing more tanks was not something he welcomed. As it turned out, because the first flotilla that was to come, there were problems there. It was the Italian Navy that was doing it with the German admiral in charge, and there were problems that delayed the process. They'd spotted the British Mediterranean fleet nearby, and so they sort of came back, and then they left without enough time to get to Crete before sunset. So they're doing that, and it's dark, so they've lost their air cover. It's gone back, and these were all in in Greek fishing boats that they'd commandeered with a sort of minimal support convoy. When there's a large force squadron of the Royal Navy appeared, and just that at least was a one-way battle the other side. So that attempted sea landing got scattered and withdrawn, and they held off the two further ones that were planned just to see what was happening. And what happened was that they got hold of the Malmö airfield and were able to land reinforcements that way. So they didn't need to make a second attempt hurriedly at landing the reinforcements by sea. They did later, when the battle in Crete was already lost. They did land some further tanks, but it didn't matter by then. They'd already won Crete.
Malmö is, it must be the turning point of the Battle of Crete. But when all those airborne troops land, there's 3 airfields on Crete. Had Freiburg issued orders specifically what to do with an air attack? Had he understood that the airfields would be the key to the operation, which ultimately they were, because, as you said, the sea landings don't work?
The troops he had at his disposal, Australian, New Zealand troops, some British troops, because there's a British garrison already there, and they landed. The only reinforcements were a couple of British units. They're around Chania, the capital, which is adjacent to Suda Bay, which is the main port connection, and around Heraklion. New Zealand troops were mostly put around Malmö. Retinau, which is a smaller airfield, had Australians covering it, but it would be, the other two were bigger airfields, so they would be more useful. And the mix of Australian and British were covering the Heraklion airfield. Put most of his troops to cover that, but he was on the lookout and wanted to keep troops that he could move to wherever the seaborne support attack was coming. They didn't know where in particular, but they just knew that from what they had, the little they had gleaned from the coded messages that they had intercepted, that there was a substantial force that was going to come by sea. He had inferred where that was likely to be, but their problem, and he'd inferred that from what they got out of the coded messages, but London was just seeing how valuable the stuff they're getting from Enigma was. The reports are called Ultra, but they're the reports of the interpretation from Enigma. It's not just the raw decode. And the message that he got back through Wavell was that London would rather lose Crete than lose Ultra. In other words, it was more important that the Germans didn't know that their code was already penetrated.
Folks, we're going to take a short break. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. I'm joined by Craig Collie, and we're discussing the Australians and New Zealanders in Greece and Crete. It's Malmö that's the problem for the Allies, and its commanders there, Andrew and Hargast. I don't like to point figures. If they seem to have lost their nerve, they seem to have, their operational awareness seems to have been the problem there, rather than the forces, because the Maoris and people put in spirited attacks, don't they? The morale didn't seem to collapse.
Andrew, who had I think it was a VC from the First World War, certainly was heavily decorated from the First World War. And that was one of the problems, that you've got these First World War veterans who see battles as two sides fighting across a line, which is called the front, the battle line. There was no battle line. The invasion force was being sprinkled from above, if you like, and they land, and there's no, until they sort of form into units and then a chase, there's no front at all. So mobility was what it was all about. And Freiburg had apparently sort of talked about mobility, and if an area is lost, you need to move quickly to take it back, because it's not one army coming from one end being stopped by an army at the other, on the other side of the line. Certainly not at this early stage. The communications were not good because they didn't have, they had limited radios. The power lines there could be cut, and they were. They were dealing with daily air attacks, and because there were 3 weeks between the evacuation from mainland Greece and the paratroop landing. So they had 3 weeks to set up as best they could, and that was still limited. On the day that the paratroops first came, there was an air attack to sort of soften them up. And in that, Andrew got some shrapnel in his temple, which probably didn't help his decision-making. He was working with a sort of format of battle that was untested. Certainly all the experience of First World War wouldn't have been much use to him there. He drew some wrong inferences from the fact that he was getting no information from two of his defending companies around that were still there, but he'd sort of persuaded himself that they had been overrun by the German paratroops that were starting to get together, actually in very small numbers, but he wasn't able to detect that. So he pulled back during the night because they couldn't withdraw from the hillock they had overlooking Malmö during the day because the Luftwaffe would be back and would be interfering with that. So his decision was to get out while we can do that with safety and just pull back from that, just assess where we are. The two companies that he thought had been overrun, the runner didn't get through, so they were still there. And it's sort of late in the night, sort of as dawn approached, they found that the defences and the command centres had gone, and they knew that by themselves they wouldn't be able to hold off, so they withdrew. They had some artillery covering the airfield, but not a great deal of it. So when the German commander of the paratroops was getting sort of information back on weak radio signals and realised that this had gone very badly, that there were far more defenders there than German intelligence had told them, that they'd lost a lot of lives, and they were just holding on by their bootlaces. He decided he needed to make a bold move. He sent a pilot in at first light to test landing on Malmö. He did. He sort of touched down, waited to sort of 30 seconds, then took off again and reported that if you landed over the far side, you've probably got a fair chance of being able to offload troops. There was a delay in a counterattack by the New Zealand troops, and it was a sort of over-coordinated, sort of overthought event that had troops coming up to replace the troops that were going, because there was still a concern about whether the seaborne attack was going to come. So they need to have troops to cover the beaches there. If that happened, it did come that night, but they were scattered. But in delaying till the night time, the Germans had sort of set themselves up enough to delay those attacks. They were delayed just by the sort of the complexity of the plan anyway. So that when morning came, the counterattack hadn't recovered the territory. It was still attempting to, but then all the planes came.
I was interested what Freiberg's thinking, because he must be looking at his other troops. I'm right in thinking that the other airfields held, didn't they?
Yes.
It's just Malmö that they're put on the back
That's right. Foot. So over days, they just kept landing reinforcements, the Germans.
And so at that point, Freiberg thinks it's the time for withdrawal once more.
Yes, the ability to move from Heraklion and Retamo to Malmö was limited. They hadn't cleared the attack force away from those two places, but they'd nullified it. Retamo, in fact, had no radio communication left, so you'd have to send a runner to tell him. That was attempted, but he was intercepted. By then, they were already being pushed back, and they were getting to the point where they decided that they were not in a position to be able to counterattack, that they had lost too much ground. They'd lost too many men. They were exhausted. Their equipment, which a lot of the artillery pieces they had, in fact, were captured guns from North Africa, and about half of them were found to be not functioning.
No hope of support coming in because it can't be flown in because they've lost the airfield.
That's right, yes.
This is another withdrawal. How is the evacuation? Is it any better than Greece?
No, it's worse because it's more desperate. These are exhausted soldiers, dispirited soldiers, still believing that we're in an even balance. They could have given the Germans a run for their money. And there were a couple of sort of almost sort of lunatic counter reactions that happened there that caught the Germans by surprise, and they were shocked. Both of them involved Maori groups, just sort of mad, rushing, yelling, shouting, Maoris doing hakas, and the poor Germans had no idea what this was about, and they hadn't seen this before, and suffered badly in those actions. But by the time you recovered the territory, you knew that by the time morning came, the planes would be back and you wouldn't be able to hold it. You'd have high rate of casualties for no purpose. And by then it was just too hopeless. It was too risky to bring what was left of the Mediterranean fleet around Crete to the northern side, because they're then vulnerable to air attack. Old Kit and Caboodle was to march over the mountainous spine that runs along Crete to a fishing village, Sfakia, on the other side. So they just trudged up this high mountain range, about 3 or 4 days of marching, mostly moving at night and just sheltering at day. But the Germans misread the movement, and they thought that they were moving across to the beginning of this road that then went over the mountains. They thought they were moving across to consolidate at Retamo and then Heraklion. So they sent a lot of their defences further along the coast, past the turnoff, if you like, to the fishing village, in the expectation that that's where they would be able to sort out what was left of the defensive force.
Did they manage to get many off?
Yes, yep, they did a reasonably good job.
Because there's no, they're ferrying people backwards and forwards. The ships aren't coming into a quay, are they?
In fact, there's not even a little pier. They would anchor out from the beach at Sfakia, send the barges in, and you'd load in. But you've now got something like 20,000 desperate men. The ones whose units have fallen apart know that they're not the priority. There are now quite a number of deserters who are not the priority. So they're desperate. It's ugly as they try and sort of marshal the units are still together, who are also doing rear guards to keep what German forces are coming through at bay, and then be able to be evacuated themselves. I think there's about sort of 10,000 are left behind, and some more like 15,000 are actually evacuated.
And the majority of those Kiwis, then?
No, it's a mixture. It's about equal of the two. The Australians were not around Malame. They were more of them were around Khanea and Suda. But a lot of them were like artillery men without guns, drivers without trucks, who were then rapidly trained as infantry and made a fair stab of it, but they were not even semi-experienced soldiers. They were the units who were tending to sort of disbanded because their leadership was shot. They were only sort of put together ad hoc. So they were the ones that tended to try and get to Sfakia first to see if they could get off before the priorities deemed that they were going to be at the end of the line. As far as I can recall, it was a sort of fairly even mix of those left behind, partly because the still formed units were Australian ones that hadn't been that involved in the fighting. They were backup. It was the 7th Battalion, which was Australian. Large proportion of them got left behind because of the problems with all the milling crowds. The Navy ships had to leave at a certain time, otherwise they ran the risk of still being within reach of the German planes in the morning.
Now, you mentioned earlier that the Cretians gave those on the run in Crete quite a lot of help. Did many get off? Did many remain on the island for a long time undiscovered?
Yes, some of them were still there at the end of the year. This, of course, was May when they were... and some of them were there for a couple of years even, a handful. There were various forms of boats that they commandeered or fixed up. A couple of landing barges have been left behind by the evacuation ships, so they were able to use them. 10 days with very little water and very little food, found themselves bumping up on the northern shore of Africa. There's a few hundred that got across that way. The British Special Operations
SOE.
They were just starting to get active there, and there were two pickups. They were sort of finding groups of Australians, New Zealanders still sort of wandering around up in the mountains where the Germans sort of weren't looking that hard. Two lots of submarines, two British submarines, had been arranged, I think we're looking here July, August, to pick up at a Greek Orthodox monastery on the south coast, to pick up what wandering troops they could manage to get and brought them into the monastery. And about 100, 120 in each of those two pickups were taken across to Egypt. But the Germans then found that the monastery was being used for that purpose. So, in fact, they came looking for the abbot who had been organising it. But the abbot, knowing that he was under threat, they evacuated him to Egypt as well. But they sort of took over the monastery and sort of smashed it up a bit, and certainly prevented it being used as a departure point for the subs. A couple of times there were fishing boats that were organised that picked up, and another crowd of wandering soldiers that had been found. So in bits and pieces, some of them trickled back. Some of them also eventually found themselves being captured, not because the villagers, but because you can hide forever from Germans who are looking for you.
No, indeed. I was amazed that they were sending out submarines to pick them all up. It just seems a tremendous effort. They weren't quite abandoned.
The belief was, amongst other things, that politically you had to make an effort to pick up these soldiers when they knew the numbers that had been left behind.
So what happened to those Aussies and Kiwis that got off? Because I assume for them the war was not yet over.
No, assuming that they were able to recover their health sufficiently, they went back to their units by and large. Then the Australian forces were being evacuated to meet the anticipated Japanese threat, Pearl Harbor being in December of that year. Against Churchill's wishes, they didn't see any need for them to go back there, but the government had changed in Australia. The Curtin government had come in, and Menzies, who might have been more agreeable to, but not necessarily to Churchill's needs, Curtin said they're coming back to defend their country, and we're a sovereign nation, the sort of point that you made earlier. It hadn't been made at the beginning of the Greek adventure, but by then there was the belief was that the Australian soldiers were needed now to defend Australia, not to help Britain be defended.
And what happens to the New Zealanders? They
stayed in Europe, so they participated in the North Africa drive as the Africa Corps was driven out. That was New Zealanders and English forces. By then, the Australians were being removed. So one of the Australian divisions stayed there longer than the others, but eventually all of them were brought back. And the New Zealanders mostly joined the English and Americans in the drive up for Italy.
I always think it's the most remarkable political decision for the New Zealanders to take the decision to leave the New Zealand troops in the Northern Hemisphere and not withdraw them for what is a real home threat defence.
Yes, I don't know what their thinking was because I haven't sort of researched that, but my guess is that their view is by then, because MacArthur had been driven out of the Philippines, so he'd set up in Australia. So the counter-offensive was going to come from Australia. Well, that's what it appeared. In fact, it came from Australia, and the Navy, Nimitz, came through Guadalcanal, which caught the Japanese on the wrong foot. They'd read all the articles in Life magazine about MacArthur, which MacArthur had written, so they assumed that the whole counter-offensive was going to be MacArthur's and would be driven from Melbourne through New Guinea. Perhaps the New Zealanders took the view that if the Americans and the Australians can't stop the Japanese and Australia is there before us, then we're not going to be able to do it. So we'll need to look at how we're going to deal with that. And they may well have thought, well, we might just have to just come to some agreement with Japan, which is what the Greeks, by the time they had surrendered on the mainland, Greece had surrendered, had I think, had come to the conclusion that they would have been better to have just deal with Germany as Romania and Bulgaria had, where might have something that amounts to an occupation force, but it's not one that's occupying a defeated country.
I don't really have any more questions, but I have just one curiosity question, really. The fall of Crete, I mentioned it was perhaps a poison chalice with Freiburg left in charge. I just wondered how it's viewed now. Do they from a southern hemisphere point of view, do the New Zealanders get the blame, or does Freiburg come away quite well and Hargast and Andrew get the blame, or does the British get the blame, or have we moved beyond finger pointing? I was just slightly curious.
No one talks about Greece and Crete much, but when it happened, someone had to be found to be the scapegoat, and the British, I suppose understandably, didn't particularly want to be that. And I can see why Britain needed the American bill, the Lend-Lease bill, to be passed. And that was difficult. And their advice that Churchill was getting from Roosevelt was, you need to be seen to be fighting Nazis, otherwise I can't get this through politically. And the only Nazis available were the ones that were going to come into Greece. So it was the best opportunity. Whether that was in Greece's interest or not didn't matter. This was the only way we could continue to fund our defence of the war. So that had its reasons for taking place. It's probably not a reason that you can sort of publicise, we only did it for the money, but it's the reality of it. There was looking around for who's to blame, and Freiburg was the one that was generally chosen. He was convenient. He wasn't English, although he was actually born in England, but he left there at the age of 3. To most people who now sort of look at that, Hargast is the main problem. Hargast was a brave guy who had fought valiantly in the First World War, but he suffered bouts of shell shock afterwards. And he was initially knocked back for overseas service in New Zealand, but he was a member of Parliament, not of Peter Fraser's party, from the other party, but he lobbied Fraser to get this knockback overturned. He wanted to be part of it. And so against Freiburg's wishes, he was reinstated and came with the New Zealand force. And there are moments in which he is clearly struggling with the same problem. Andrew is a different case in as much as no one ever says much about his wound except that he has one. But I suspect that was part of his problem in assessing wrongly, and he didn't get good support from Hargast either. So he had everything was working against him. It was a new form of battle that he had no experience of. He had poor communications and drew the wrong inference from what little he was getting. He was probably dealing with the wound in his head, as well as the fact that they had been for the last 2 months under constant bombardment, so their nerves are going to be a bit rattled. Even a guy who's a senior commander can get his nerves rattled. And he just made some wrong decisions that happened to be the ones that enabled the Germans to dig themselves out of a very precarious position.
They're in a similar sized hole at one point. Yeah, I just wondered, I didn't know if it was viewed differently in Australia and New Zealand, and on whether you laid blame or, as I say, we moved beyond it.
Oh, we usually we look for the English to blame.
Well, I know that's where I was looking. I was wondering how far up the food chain we could go.
And I think you can probably do that. But in fact, mostly no one knows much about, certainly in Australia, about Greece. Crete was more a New Zealand action. And I think the feeling there is it was a hopeless cause from the start. So it's no one's fault. I mean, it should have been much more convincing right from the outset for the Germans, except their intelligence was bad.
I think Crete also gets remembered for the fact that the Germans did the first enormous airborne drop, which no one had ever tried before. So I think You can always be sympathetic for those guys on the land because they didn't really expect that many people to fall from the sky on them.
That's right. Well, they had a reasonable idea to the extent they did. Certainly the Germans who were falling had no idea there were as many defenders there. There was something like 10 times the defence force that their intelligence had led them to believe. They had also been told that the Cretans will welcome you because they hate their government. And while the premise was right, they don't like their government. They also don't like anyone that's coming to take their land from them. And their response to that, there were little old ladies in black who'd sort of, if a parachuter got caught in a tree in his parachute, he suddenly found a little old lady in black sort of hacking away at him with a machete. And he's sort of thinking, what's happening here? I thought they were going to welcome us. It should have been an easy victory, and probably an airborne attack was still at other times, but Hitler didn't want to try that again. It had given it a bad name.
Craig, we'll leave it there. Thank you. Folks, if you want to dive deeper, Craig's book is Where the Flaming Hell Are We? The story of young Australians and New Zealanders fighting the Nazis in Greece and Crete. As always, you can find a link on the website and in the show notes. That is all for this episode. I'm not quite sure what we'll be discussing next time, so it will be a surprise to all of us. So until then, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our town, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.